We will start. Probably here in another minute, just in case. Does anyone have any questions before we start? Okay, and can everyone see my screen? Awesome, awesome. Okay, let's get going. We're talking about identifying assumptions. So we're going to talk a little bit about assumptions, and then we're going to do some practice questions and talk through the answers. So let's get started. Does anyone know what assumptions are in critical reasoning? And would you like to share? Oh, I don't know what that means. Okay. Oh. Oh, okay. So I see. Sorry, I'm not as familiar with this format. But assumptions are basically the things in a critical reasoning argument that aren't stated in the argument. Yeah, exactly. So logical link is great. A bridge between the conclusion and the premises. And let's see if we can do the next thing. Right. Yes. And why do assumptions matter? In a critical reasoning argument, everything that's in the prompt is unassailable. So you have to take the premises as true. You can't attack those. And then obviously the conclusion is the author's main point. So you can't be like, you don't think that. That's not really a point of weakness. Authors will always assume that their arguments are correct. The only place where you can really prod at weaknesses or shore up against them is in the unwritten assumptions. So this is very basic first level stuff. But if you can do well on identifying assumptions, then you can do well on most critical reasoning stuff. So we're going to work through 5 example questions, and you'll get 2 minutes to do it on your own, and then we'll review them together, and we can discuss if anyone got anything different or anything like that. So if you guys are ready, I'm going to pull up the first one. And then I will give you 2 minutes starting now-ish. Okay, some people said C. Great. I'm glad that we're on the same page. I do like to break down the argument just because that's the way to be most sure that you're clear where everything stands. So this one's pretty short. There's a premise, there's a conclusion. Um, the answer is C because obviously, if there were pesticides, then that would make conventionally grown produce potentially more harmful than organically grown produce. But on this, it's pretty easy to work through. Like, this is a pretty simple problem, but I would just say always have a reason for removing answers just as they get harder. That's very helpful. So, like, this one is about the taste is different, but we don't care about that. We're not concerned with flavor. We're specifically concerned with health benefits. Um, Nutrients from the soil, not really the part of the plant life that we're worried about. Prices, that is not what we're talking about here. We're talking only about health benefits, and then methods of farming. That's way before we get to this point. So, did anyone not see C as a good answer? Did you have any questions on that? Okay, awesome. Oh, all right, Priyanka. So, um, let's go back. So side-by-side tests of fruits and vegetables grown using conventional and organic methods have found no significant differences between the levels of key nutrients in the conventionally grown produce and the levels of those nutrients in organically grown produce. So conventionally grown produce has nutrients and levels, and organically grown produce has equivalent nutrients. Um, the conclusion is here. There is no reason to believe that there is any health benefit to be derived from eating organically grown produce rather than conventionally grown produce. So the reason C is an assumption that the argument relies on is because, say, like, two things are equally healthy, right? But one has arsenic poison in it. Which one are you going to choose? So if one does have health harming, if conventional produce does have health harming chemicals and organically grown produce does not have those health harming chemicals, then this conclusion does not stand. But that is why this is an assumption that links the conclusion to the premise. Does that make sense? Any other questions, or are we ready? And that, I mean, like, that's a good point too. Like I said, looking through that, this is the only premise that concerns health. Looking through the options and finding reasons to discard the bad ones is pretty reliable, because most critical reasoning questions, depending on how hard they are, like, three answers are just going to be trash. And there will be one or two answers that are any good at all, and that will save you a lot of trouble and guesswork. All right, I feel good. Let's look at the next example. Here we are. Okay. Most residents of Spring Hills lack health insurance. That's just some background info. Blue Health, a nationwide insurance company, just announced that it will offer health insurance for a deeply discounted price to all Spring Hills residents who do not have any pre-existing conditions. That is the premise. Therefore, by next month, most Spring Hills residents will have health insurance. The conclusion above is based on which of the following assumptions. So, um, let's talk through these. No other health insurance companies will follow Blue Health's lead and begin offering similar health insurance at a discounted price to the residents of Spring Hills. This one doesn't work because the conclusion doesn't say that most residents of Spring Hills will have health insurance through Blue Health. It just says by next month, most residents will have health insurance at all. So even if it was from someone else, it wouldn't matter. So this one is not an assumption the conclusion relies on. It will take many months for most residents of Spring Hills to learn about the health insurance being offered by Blue Health. This is not a conclusion, or this is not an assumption that this conclusion relies on. This would weaken this conclusion, but we're just looking for assumption it relies on. Being covered by health insurance is an important part of any wealth management strategy. They're just like a general opinion. It's not pertinent specifically to this. Blue Health is able to offer health insurance for a deeply discounted price to Spring Hills residents because the cost of healthcare in Spring Hills is unusually low. So this is a trap answer, and here is why. Earlier, I was talking about how whenever there's a premise in a critical reasoning argument, it's true. So you can't argue with a premise. This is a classic GMAT trap answer because it's trying to like explain this premise that part of it is that they have the deeply discounted price. But we don't care why that's happening. That doesn't matter to us. We already know what's happening. So we can just move on. Justifying it isn't necessary, but that is a great reason to line out your conclusions and your premises in your notebook just so you can keep everything straight. And then E, most residents of Spring Hills do not suffer from at least one medical condition that Blue Health categorizes as a pre-existing condition. So it specifies that they will not be giving health insurance to people who do have pre-existing conditions. And then the conclusion does not include that caveat. But if they did, if most residents of Spring Hills do have pre-existing conditions that would preclude them from qualifying for the Blue health insurance, then this does not hold up. So this is an assumption on which the argument depends. Does that make sense? Does anyone have any other answers? Sweet. And then this is just where I break that down and answer E. All right, let's look at our next one. Okie doke, let's break this one down. In the country of Junipero, mangoes are being grown, processed, and shipped to markets in Junipero at the maximum possible rate of 2,000 mangoes per day. That's some background information. In Junipero, when demand for a good exceeds the supply of that good, the cost of that good increases. Yes, of course. Thus, since the current level of demand for mangoes in Junipero is 3,000 mangoes per day, the price of mangoes sold in Junipero will soon increase. Okay. Which of the following is an assumption on which the argument depends? So, right now the demand is 3,000. They're maxed out at 2,000, and that's what they're producing. They explain the concept of balancing supply and demand here, and that applies in Junipero, which is good to know, because if it didn't, that would change things. And then basically the conclusion is, since demand exceeds supply, the price of mangoes will soon increase. So let's look at our choices. Most residents of Junipero will begin to substantially reduce their mango consumption. Again, this is something that's like trying to argue with a premise. We were looking at the current numbers, and so it doesn't matter if they do that or not. Right now, the demand is 3,000 and the supply is 2,000. The mango production in Junipero is limited by the relatively small number of acres available in the country for growing mangoes. This is trying to explain this maximum possible rate, but again, if it's in the passage, it is taken as factual, so we do not need to explain it. Almost all residents of Junipero will not begin to travel to and purchase mangoes in the nearby country of mangosteen, where mangoes are less expensive than they are in Junipero. So if they globalize or at least slightly expand their mango market, then they're not restricted by the country's hard limits on mango production. This is an assumption that the argument relies on, because if Junipero is not an independent island and they can just like cross over to the next country, then they're not nearly so limited by their current demand and supply. D, there are other fruits sold in Junipero that have the exact, so again, we're talking about mangoes. We do not care about other fruits. And then E, over the past few months, mango farmers have developed innovative ways to increase the number of mangoes that they are able to grow. So we know that they're maxed out at 2,000. So that is just trying to sway us there, I guess, but we already have the information that we have to work with. So it is C. Does anyone have any questions on that? All right. And then this is just our breakdown and our answer. And then here we have example 4. Okay, let's talk it through. In a recent medical study, all of the study participants who had abused alcohol in the past 5 years were found to be suffering with depression. Thus, it must be the case that abusing alcohol causes depression. Um, each of the following is an assumption upon which the argument depends, except. So, if you pay attention to this, it is in all caps for a reason. But if you read through all the answers, I think you would notice pretty quickly that there's several assumptions it relies on. So, A, both alcohol abuse issues and depression can be solved via the use of therapy specially designed for the treatment of alcohol abuse issues. This is not something that the argument that the conclusion relies on because we are not really to this point in the process, right? They're just talking about how abusing alcohol causes depression. We're not here for solutions. We are just trying to justify this cause and effect claim. B, the depression and alcohol abuse of the study participants were not both results of heavy use of illicit drugs. So this is an assumption the argument relies on because they're saying abusing alcohol causes depression. So if another thing causes depression or both of them and they're just like co-occurrences, then this falls apart. Be very careful with your cause and effects. C, the study participants were not found to be suffering with depression before they started abusing alcohol. Yes, it's also a classic cause and effect trap is, are they co-occurrences and they've got the order backwards? Like, does the depression cause alcohol abuse? If it does, then this conclusion falls apart. D, the study was not set up in a way such that people who were not suffering with depression would be very unlikely to participate. So if they set this study up at like a mental health clinic and that's where they recruited people for the study, a place where there's a disproportionate number of depressed people that might run across it and volunteer, then that it calls into question the results of the study because the sample size isn't generalizable. So this is an assumption that it relies on because if they did do that, then this isn't the cause. They were just specifically attracting people with depression. And E, the concurrence of alcohol abuse and depression seen in people studied was not merely a coincidence. Sure, it could just be regular old co-occurrences. So if it was, then the conclusion is weakened. So A is the only assumption the argument does not depend on. Did anyone have any other answers? Okay, cool. And then we have our breakdown and our answer. And then we're going to do one more example. Oh, yeah, we can go back. Sorry. This is not an assumption that the argument relies on because it's in the wrong it's the wrong portion of the process. So they're just saying that abusing alcohol causes depression. That's the conclusion. This could still be true or false, and the argument wouldn't change. So there's a test that is a method that people like to use sometimes when testing assumptions, the negation technique. So, like, if you negate this answer, for instance, and the depression and alcohol abuse of the study participants were both results of heavy use of illicit drugs, then the conclusion doesn't work. But if you negate A, like both alcohol abuse issues and depression cannot be solved via the use of therapy, specially designed for the treatment of alcohol abuse issues, well, that doesn't change the conclusion at all. It could stand equally well either way. That's why it's A. Cool. Cool, cool. Okay. One more. Let's do it. Let's go through this. So, home ownership, as opposed to renting a home, can have many benefits, both for individuals who own homes and for society as a whole. While fewer than 50% of the country's citizens own homes, the government does little to encourage home ownership. By doing more to encourage home ownership by making people aware of the advantages of home ownership, house over renting, the government could improve conditions both for individuals and for society in general. So, the conclusion, always find your conclusions. Here's one. This is the conclusion. By doing more to encourage home ownership, the government could improve conditions both for individuals and for society in general. And it's based on home ownership can have many benefits both for societies and individuals. And this, while fewer than 50% of the country's citizens own homes, the government does little to encourage home ownership. Let's work through our conclusions and we'll play with the negation technique a little bit more so you can see what I was talking about. Which of the following is an assumption on which the argument relies? A, crime rates are lower in cities in which the ratio of homeowners to renters is relatively high because people who own homes tend to feel invested in their communities. So this one is trying to explain part of the premises. We already know that there's benefits, so we don't really need like an explanation of why. It says that there's benefits. All right, there are. B, people involved in government are interested in improving conditions for individuals and society at large. I saw this one was popular. The conclusion is by doing more to encourage homeownership, by making people aware of the advantages, the government could improve conditions both for individuals and for society in general. So, if people involved in government are interested in improving conditions for individuals and society at large, can this conclusion hold? I would argue so. What if they're not? Like, what if the people in government are not at all interested in improving conditions for individuals and society at large? This can still be true by doing more to encourage home ownership. I mean, it might be less likely that they would do so, but the conclusion is that if they did encourage home ownership by making people aware of the advantages, then they can improve conditions for both individuals and for society in general. So this is a tempting answer, but if you negate it, you can see that it does not nullify the conclusion. Without government encouragement to buy homes, most people in the country will choose to rent the homes in which they live. This one doesn't, yeah, if you negate it, it would not change anything. I think it's also kind of, yes, so exactly, Cliff. We're not talking about government intentions here. We're talking about, hey, if they did this, I think that this would happen, right? So we're not at the intentions part, if that makes sense. We're just saying if they took this action, this would be the outcome. D, the post-retirement housing expenses of people who own homes are often lower than those of people who rent. This is just trying to sell us on owning homes. Whether or not they are does not change the conclusion. And E, some of the people who are currently renting homes or considering renting homes could afford to buy homes should they choose to do so. This is an assumption the argument relies on because this claim is if they let people know that there are advantages to home ownership over renting, then people would buy homes basically. Like that would increase home ownership. But if you can't afford to do something, it doesn't matter how aware you are that it's out there. Like you're not going to do it. So the government could tell people all day, but if they don't have any money, it doesn't matter. Does that track for everyone? Trying to see the chat, but it's getting away from me. Oh, okay. So for C, without government encouragement to buy homes, most people in the country will choose to rent the homes in which they live. Okay, so without government encouragement to buy homes, what if most people would not choose to rent the homes in which they live? So basically, hold on. Advantages of homeownership. This one is a little bit weird for negation because it's actually trying to explain a premise, I believe. So they're saying fewer than 50% of the country's citizens own homes, but the government does little to encourage home ownership. So this sort of is trying to explain why that's the case, but we aren't concerned with why the premise is the case because it doesn't matter why people are renting, just that most people are renting. And then without government encouragement to buy homes. Okay, yeah. Most people in the country want you. So yeah, the problem with this one is that it's trying to explain the premise, so it doesn't work as well for negation as compared to like this one. But just the main thing with that is anything that's trying to explain a premise, probably a waste of time. Anything that's trying to argue with a premise's validity, also a waste of time. If it says that's what's happening, then that's what's happening. Does that make sense? Okay. And then that was our answer. Okay. So let me stop sharing and then go over here. This is a good point about if most people rent, it doesn't mean a non-significant number of people might still buy. So they do love to throw around words like some and most that can mean a lot of different things. And again, like we know that most people are renting because it's in the prompt. Or, yeah, while fewer than 50% of the country's citizens own homes, the government does little to encourage home ownership. That doesn't necessarily mean that more people couldn't buy homes, right? Does anyone have any other questions? Okay. Does everyone get the negation technique, or do you want me to pick another example and we can go back through it? Okay, we can do one more. The level of these examples are kind of mixed, so I try to start easy and then go hard. I would say I don't know exactly where they would fall on the exam, but they're like TTP examples, so they're just easy, medium, and hard. So I would say the last one is probably like 680 or 645-ish and up. And then the first two are easy, or like the easiest ones, and then the second middle ones are like in the lower sixes would be my guesstimate. But that's no guarantee as far as like, I'm personally not a great judge of like how hard questions are, and I kind of think that people can get a little psyched out by that because sometimes things are very clear to you, but they are not clear to other people at all. Okay, so let's look at this one. I think is good for, we can just go through these and you can see from example 1, we'll do some negation technique stuff. So, sorry. So this one has several that you can negate that I think are pretty straightforward, because the conclusion is there's no reason to believe that there is any health benefit to be derived from eating organically grown produce rather than conventionally grown produce. So fruits and vegetables that are grown using organic methods do not taste different from those grown using conventional methods. Well, what if they do taste different? Does that mean that this conclusion falls apart? It doesn't, because it's not about taste. Plants take in nutrients from the soil as a necessary aspect of their growth process. So this one actually does work okay for negation, but it is also, I don't even know, I guess it's very softly like trying to argue with the health benefits thing. But if plants didn't take nutrients in from the soil as a necessary aspect of their growth processes, we already know that there is no significant difference between the levels of key nutrients in the conventionally grown produce and those of organically grown produce. Let's see. The differences between the prices of most organically grown produce and those of most conventionally grown produce are not justified. Well, what if they were? Or alternatively, like, what if there's no difference in price? It doesn't change the fact that we're specifically talking about health benefits. And then the methods used in farming organically grown produce tend to be more labor intensive than those used in farming conventionally grown produce. Well, again, if they were not more labor intensive, then would that affect the health benefits of organic versus conventionally grown produce? It would not. So that is kind of how the negation technique is supposed to work. If you just said the opposite of what this is, does the argument hold? I think we did that. Oh. Okay. Okay, it was not visible. Awesome. Sorry about that. But did you, I can go back through them if you would like me to, or if you can see what I'm talking about. Let me see. Bear with me just a second, and I'll see if I can find it. What's it doing? Okay. Those are the examples I have on hand, but I can definitely next time bring a couple harder ones if people feel like that would be valuable. Any other questions? Okay. So we probably will do, I'm trying to do like a theme per week. So we're probably going to do one next week that's a different theme. And to that point, I will do some with like the bold-faced method of reasoning as well. I do not know exactly when, but probably I will do like one a week, and they should have the titles, so I can definitely try to get that one out in the next couple of weeks if that is something people are interested in. Um, I think that they are going to share the recording later. Marketing will, because they are having me record it. And then I know TTP has like a ton of assumption questions, but you can also, it's called like identify the assumption. You can also sort on GMAT Club and stuff like that by question type and see those. Here's the deal with practice on assumptions. Like I said, this is a very cornerstone skill. So any strengthen the argument question, any weaken the argument question, like all of those will have an assumptions aspect. It won't necessarily be like pick the assumption out of a lineup, but it is a good thing to just, I like to read the passage and then sometimes like practice just writing down off the top of my head, oh, here's 5 things I noticed aren't covered that seem to be necessary to get from premises A and B to the conclusion. Yep, I only use the target test prep materials because they are the ones that let me use their materials. So, and I am mostly familiar with target test prep because that's what I used. And so I can recommend that. I did very well on my verbal. I got a perfect score. So they are pretty good, but there are plenty of things that you can check out. A lot of stuff is just like what's going to be the best fit for you, like what makes the most sense to you. Um, yes. So even if the question isn't like identify the assumption, that doesn't mean you don't need to identify your assumptions because kind of like we were talking about, you can't pick apart premises. So where are you going to weaken an argument? You have to do it through the assumptions. I prepared for like 9 months, so I spent quite a lot of time. Anything else? I just took the test once. I studied honestly like 10 to 20 hours a week, kind of depending on the week. And I did a lot of, it's kind of hard to say how long I did prepare on verbal because I would switch out between quant and verbal a lot because I feel like that's the easiest way to keep your mind fresh. So, like, you can feel very burned out on verbal and then go do some quant and be like, actually, this is fine. It's just the switching out kind of lets you use your brain in a different way. So, it lets you get more out of the study sessions. And I also only took the test once, so it's a little bit hard to see what the improvement was. But I would definitely say when I first started, I wasn't clear on how a lot of the parts worked. But once I I don't know. You really do have to drill in critical reasoning and reading comp as well, just because it's not that you can't read things and understand them, it's that to take the test requires a very specific application of reading comprehension. And so I did not do very well on my first like mock questions through the MBA website, but once I kind of understood more what they were looking for, it was much easier. Yeah, spaced repetition, big fan. Are the real GMAT questions similar to questions from TTP? Here's what I will say about particularly my verbal experience, that I didn't have any live exam questions that were nearly as hard as the TTP, like hard verbal questions. Some of them are just very challenging. And a lot of even like my mock exam questions were harder than my actual exam questions. It does kind of depend on luck, but the TTP hard questions are no joke. I don't think that they care if you take the test a few times. It's not like the MCAT where like if you take it 3 times, then they're going to judge you. If you have to take it a handful of times, I don't think they hold that against you. I wouldn't like rush through and try to retake it a bunch of times if you're not fixing like what you're messing up on. Like if you aren't doing well on some type of question, I would definitely take a break, and then instead of like rushing through retakes, just like maybe prep a little bit longer, because I know that people get into kind of a spiral with the retake sometimes. The reading comp is the long form. So honestly, I would say focus on critical reasoning up front, because the reading comp long form questions they build a lot on critical reasoning. They use a lot of like opinion stuff and like conclusions and the strength of arguments. And then they do tack on some other stuff, particularly the questions that ask you to like frame what's written down, like, oh, paragraph 1 is an introduction to a theory, like paragraph 2 explains the theory, that sort of thing. There's a bit more of that, but a lot of it is like noticing author's tone, noticing the same sort of assumptions and gaps, and then going from there. It's just longer. So I would probably do a lot of your critical reasoning prep before I worry too much about reading comprehension, because you will need a lot of those skills that carry over. Yeah. We can look at, yeah, do you want to do one that we're just doing hard questions? I did my undergrad at the University of Arkansas, and I'm doing my MBA. Well, there's a couple of things I'm waiting on, but I am narrowing it down. But yes, I can definitely make a note to look at one that's just like hard verbal. Let me do that. And boldface, nothing amazing. Okay. Anything else, guys? Okay. I think that we are all caught up, and I will see you next week. If you want to come back for the next webinar, I will narrow down topics, and then we can go through something, and hopefully we can learn some things. Thank you all.